Being a worker in a graveyard, either digging graves or general maintenance, has the advantage of letting me wander around the churchyard in my free time, looking at various tombstones and the stories that they tell, or, more to the point, they do not tell. Because no matter how hard you look at some of these tombstones, you don't get the full story. For instance, let me talk about Danny Baker. Old Danny was a tramp. No two ways about that. That was the way of life that he had chosen. And he was on the road for more than 60 years, born and bred in the Cotswolds. A few years ago, it was on a wintry night back up in the Cotswolds, and Danny was running out of time. He had hoped to get to the nearby town that night to go into one of the hostels where he could get accommodation. But for various reasons, he was running late and behind time. And now it was dark. The first flurries of snow were beginning to buzz around him, and his old bones told him that bad weather was on the way. They were rarely wrong. His clothes were threadbare, and he knew if he was going to stand any chance at all of surviving the night, then he had to find shelter. By chance, it seemed, but perhaps it may have been by other means, perhaps his instinct, his homing instinct, he found himself at the edge of the lane down which he used to live. He hadn't been down there for over 60 years, and the more he thought about it, if his cottage was still standing, there'd be somewhere for him to take shelter for the night. He put a mittened hand in his pocket, he pulled out a coin. Heads I go down, he said, tails I go elsewhere. He put it on the back of his other hand, and it was really no contest. In the gathering gloom, he could see the coin said heads, so down the lane he went. He realised, going down there, that after all these years, never having been down since the morning he left, the cottage might not even still be standing. When he got to the edge of the lane, the cottage was standing, or to be more correct, what was left of it was still standing. Very much a derelict ruin. No glass to be seen in any of the windows. The roof was, well, there were more holes than tiles on the roof, and no door. It was in a terrible state. But Danny knew at least he would afford some type of shelter for the night. And as he stood at the entrance to the overgrown garden that had once been his mam's pride and joy, he remembered the last time he had come home. And that was when he had been demobbed from the army following the end of the war in November 1918. He had lied about his age and joined the colours at a very early age, and had survived the whole of the horrors of the First World War. And now, unwilling to stay in the army another day longer than he had to, he had been demobbed as soon as he could and had made his way home. How well he remembered that night. He stood at the gateway, looking up at the cottage, which was a blaze of lights. There were lights in all the windows that his mother had put there to welcome her soldier son home. His father had long since died. And as he opened the gate, the front door opened and a black and white collie dog hurtled down the pathway, yapping, squealing and barking happily, tail a wag as he recognised his beloved master and leapt up into Danny's arms. For a moment, dog and Danny only had eyes for one another. And gradually he made his way up the path to where his mam was standing. He recognised her cottage loaf-shaped figure as she stood in the doorway. Behind her, the kitchen was a blaze of lights, and on the air was the wonderful aroma of freshly baking cherry cake. Oh, ma'am, he said, wrapping his arms around her. And for a while, his tears mingled with her tears before she led the way into the kitchen. It's cherry cake, she said, your favourite, as if he really needed any telling. Oh, ma'am, he said, you'll never know how much your cherry cake kept me and my mates going in the trenches. How are your mates, Danny, she said. Have they all gone home as well? Yes, he said, they've gone home. adding silently, those of them who were still alive, that if you could call their shattered bodies and minds still alive. They had a very simple supper, fresh cheese, fresh bread and fresh milk, topped up with a wonderful slice of freshly baked cherry cake. After that, Danny felt he really couldn't sleep in a bed that night and was more than happy to lie down in front of the fire with Rex for company, his dog. And his mother was quite happy to let him lie there. Sadly, his mother died a few months later, and with nothing to keep him back at home, then one morning Danny closed the door, locked it, and with Rex, his faithful companion, they took to the road as a tramp. When Rex died, Danny carried on as a loner, and he'd walked over most of the roads in England, Wales and Scotland. And from time to time, he even came back to the Cotswolds, like he had now. He now came back to the present and made his way through the tangled undergrowth, pushed away into what was left of the kitchen. He got a fire going, that wasn't difficult, and then he had his billy can, which he topped up with snow, and very soon had some boiling water on the go. Into that he crumbled a stock cue and knew that no matter what happened, he wouldn't go hungry or too hungry that night. He'd noticed with great sadness when he came through the village, to the old village shop, and not only was it closed, it had been sold and was now a private house. So there was no chance of him getting any food there. And as he sat looking into the fire, looking back over his life, he had no regrets. After the war, he found he couldn't settle down, and taking tramping to the roads was really the best way he had of getting himself sorted out. And now, after all those years, here he was back again. And even as he thought about it, and he remembered that night when he'd come home, his nose suddenly caught the aroma, the wonderful aroma of fresh baking, and he recognized it as being a freshly baking cherry cake. He had no idea whatsoever where it was coming from, because there were no other buildings anywhere in the area. And as he sat there, he heard a bit of a snuffling sound, and a black and white dog suddenly came and nestled alongside him. "Hello, Rex," he said, and made a fuss of the dog. Even as he did so, he was aware of his mother standing alongside him. "Hello, ma'am," he said. "Hello, Danny," she said. "We knew you were coming today, and Rex hasn't left the door all day. And I've been baking. It's your favourite cherry cake." And she handed him a slice of cake, which he took with his right hand. Danny slowly fell asleep in front of what was left of the fire. It was some days later when the first police Land Rover was able to make its way over the snow-covered icy roads to get to the old cottage. There'd been reports of a light being seen and smoke having been smelt, but the weather had been so bad, nobody had been able to get there before. And although they could see from the snow around the old building, nobody had been in there for ages. The two policemen were conscientious, and they went inside, and that was where they found old Danny's body. The older policeman recognised him and said, "Oh, it's old Danny Baker. It's said that he used to live round here once upon a time, but he never caused anybody any trouble, and he hadn't been seen for a while." They had to fetch a doctor out to pronounce that Danny was dead, and the doctor came and with the policeman turned him over to examine Danny's body properly. And they were surprised to see, nestled up alongside Danny, was the body of a black and white collie-type dog. They looked at his collar and saw that he bore the name Rex. It was easy to explain the dog being there as a stray who had come in for company. As I said, that was easy to explain. What they couldn't explain was what old Danny, held in his right hand. It was a slice of freshly baked and still warm cherry cake. It's a tale I was told. It may be true. If you want to believe it, that's up to you. Good evening. In my job as a grave digger, general maintenance worker around churchyards, I read tombstones. I read them when I'm at work. I read them in my spare time. And there are all sorts of tales and information held on a tombstone that may or may not give you the full story. And even when I travel on holiday, much to the family's dismay, I spend some of my time going around churchyards as well. So my next tale comes from what I picked up in a little churchyard in rural France. I won't mention the village's name, but it's set way back in the Languedoc-Cevennes area. You may think that hatred, is a terrible emotion, but there may be a reason for it. On the other hand, there are those who suggest that revenge is a dish best served cold. You can make your own mind up on this one. The story begins in the year 1816 in the little village I've just mentioned. It is a few months after the final defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo the year before, and France is beginning to get back to normal. Some of the aristos and other members of the church who've been in exile during the Revolution and the Napoleonic times have now made their way back to France. And France is starting to go back to its old way of life. And one of the customs that has been reintroduced in this particular village is what is known as festival night. What happens at festival night is that the villagers and those from surrounding villages, if they feel so moved, may come into the village. They can confess their sins, and the sins are all confession, sins and all the rest directed onto a straw effigy. The straw man, always a man, is known as the sin man, and he absorbs all the sins. And when the confession has finished, the lord of the manor, unless anybody else has a better claim, then lights the sin man, and all the sins of the village and that area are got rid of for the next year. After that has happened, then it is a sign for a general orgy basically starting up, drinking and all the rest. The local curé, Michel Sancerre, is not very happy with the festival. He never has been, but since the revolution and his return from exile, his congregation has been so small, so he felt that just agreeing to festival night is at least a way of keeping some of his congregation coming to church. Unseen by anybody at that moment in time, also attending the festival was Pierre Rideau. He was heavily hooded, and there was a reason for that, which I will explain a little bit later on. And Pierre's eyes are glowing red with hatred, because he can well remember the last festival night he attended, which was in the year 1789. At that time, there were rumours coming down through France of there having been a revolution in Paris, but nothing firm, just rumours. And back in their village, the local lord of the manor, Charles de Billigue, is a young aristocrat of the worst possible kind. He believes that the villagers are peasants and should be treated with utter disdain. There's no time for any of them, but in particular, he does not like the Rideau family, because Pierre's father is very radical in his views and does not hesitate at all to make his views known. And so the Billigue, on this night in 1789, has made sure that he's going to teach the villagers a lesson they will never forget. Once he set light to the straw man, his bodyguards no more than local thugs, were then told they could run riot in the village, steal what they wanted. During the course of their rampaging, they caused a fire, and as a result of the fire, Pierre's father, mother and sister died, and Pierre was badly burned. As far as the lord of the manor was concerned, that was a bonus, and he had no regrets. The revolution came along, and de Beligue, along with his fellow aristos, sought exile in England. But now, France is settling back again under a monarchy, and it is time for the young Charles, now not so young, to come back and take up the reins again. And so we move to 1816, and here he is on this particular night. We go through the system of everybody wanting to confess, just so they can have a clear conscience for the orgy that is to follow. And the mayor, once all the confession has happened, hands a flaming torch to de Beligue and says, it's your right to set light to the straw man. That is, unless anybody else has a better claim. In the silence that followed, Pierre Rideau called out, yes, I have. There's a sudden, shocked silence as Pierre marches onto centre stage, throws back the cowl that is over his face to reveal a hideously scarred face. Shock, horror runs through the crowd. It's Pierre Rideau, it's Pierre, look at his face, look at his face. They are all whispering. And as he looks in the silence that followed, Pierre looks at de Beligue, points his finger at him, and the spluttering torch goes out. You, he said to Beligue, were responsible for the death of my family. It was an accident, coward, the lord of the manor. I didn't mean any deaths to happen. They were specifically told not to harm anybody. I didn't mean it. You've got to help me, you've got to believe me. But nobody is prepared to move to help the young lord. That moment, a rather unearthly cackle came out, and an old woman, very stooped, moved up towards Pierre. The curé took hold of his cross. God save us all, he said. It's that witch, Marie Gondelet. It's the witch, they all said. And whilst they were stood there, Pierre did no more than point his finger at the young, again, not so young, lord of the manor. The time has come, he said, when I claim the right to set light to the sin man. In this case, you. No, cried de Beligue, no, won't somebody help me? Curé, you must help me. The curé, all he can do is cross himself, absolutely powerless to move, apart from which he's fascinated to see what is going to happen. He didn't have to wait very long, because as Pierre pointed his right forefinger, a streak of blue flame came out of it, settled on the count's, that's de Beligue's boots, and in a short space of time, the flame spread up his boots, onto his trousers, onto his legs, and the count died horribly that night. But nobody had any great sympathy for him. He had, after all, come back after his exile, and as far as Pierre was concerned, he was glad he had survived his exile, because his plans that he had been nurturing for some 27 years did not include the young count dying in exile or even being guillotined by the mob. As you can imagine, there was a sudden, shocked silence, and people looked at what was left of the count. He resembled something like a waxwork dummy that had shrunk, melted, and then gradually drifted into ashes and drifted into nothing. And whilst this is happening, the witch Marie Gondelet, her cackles are going all over. And the curé is still grasping his crucifix, doesn't know what to do. The mayor is in a stunned silence. How are they going to explain all this to the authorities? This is not what they wanted. But then there were those who said, well, of course, the very early sin man It was a pagan festival, and they used to burn human sacrifices. So the wheel has gone full circle. The curé approached Marie, who was still cackling, and said, "What have you done, woman?" "What have I done?" she said. "I have ensured with Pierre that there is another soul in hell tonight. At long last, Pierre can rest in peace." Curé looked at her. "What do you mean?" he said in a quiet voice. "Think," she said. "I tried to save him 27 years ago, but he died. And all this time, his spirit has been wandering this earth, waiting time for his revenge. And that time has now come and has happened." People looked. They could see Marie Gondolet, but nobody ever saw Pierre Ridoux again after that night. As I said, it was a tale from France, as it was told to me. Whether it's true or not, that is up to you to decide.